6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." This is the word of the Lord.
When did you last experience the glory of God? Were you watching the sunset over the Grand Canyon or rise over thundering ocean waves? Did you experience the glory of God in the effortless twirl of dancers spinning as one, or in the stillness that follows the swell of sound from the pipe organ and choir? Was it in the sweetly curled fingers of a newborn baby's hand, or in the last halting breaths of a beloved? Such moments are probably as close as we've come to witnessing the glory of the Lord, to which Matthew testifies in this passage. The glory that somehow mysteriously emanates from Jesus in this passage we have come to call the Transfiguration, a passage that describes a human face shining like the sun and common clothes dazzling with light. A text that describes Jesus' bodily figure transformed before our very eyes. The Transfiguration is an invitation to marvel at the awesome divinity of God made manifest in the beloved Son. Like those first disciples, we are summoned to the mountaintop to bask in a glory that is only faintly reflected in the most glorious sunrise. It is a scene so drenched in majesty that some have called it a misplaced resurrection account. This is the moment in Matthew's gospel when we glimpse for the first time the undisguised glory of God in Jesus the Christ. For weeks we have cozied up to the person of Jesus, listening intently to his Sermon on the Mount, learning from this earthly sage how to live this earthly life. His teachings have been radical, yes, but not otherworldly. But now, on this last Sunday in the season of Epiphany, Jesus is revealed to us in a new light. Here on this mountaintop, the earthbound Jesus is unveiled as the cosmic Christ, as his body is transformed before our very eyes, transfigured so we can see clearly the Son with whom the Creator is well pleased. There you have it. Transfiguration in a nutshell. A scene from the life of Jesus that the church has pointed to for centuries to support one of our central claims, that the Jesus who is fully human is also fully God. That age-old interpretation may be enough illumination of this story for many of us, but as I see it, the task of the preacher is to pull back the veil so that the light might shine a little bit more brightly on our path of discipleship. So as I read and reread this familiar story this week, the question that emerged for me is how does the transfiguration of Christ invite transformation today? As I was studying this text, I learned something. The word we translate as transfigure is a Greek word with which you are all familiar, a word that has given titles to the works of Ovid and Kafka, and now to the sermon, Metamorphosis. The metamorphosis of Christ. The transformation of Christ. Unlike the word transfiguration, which quite frankly Jesus has a monopoly on in my mind, metamorphosis could happen to anything in all creation. The divine does not have exclusive rights on the experience of transformation. In fact, encounters with the divine usually invite transformation. I think we see that here in this story. In this story where three unsuspecting disciples behold the glory of God, where Peter, James, and John witness the metamorphosis of Christ and are invited to embrace a transformation of their own. Just 6 days and 8 verses before these disciples trek up the mountain, they learn what Jesus' ministry and what their own ministry must look like. Jesus has revealed that he will endure great suffering and die before being raised again, and that all who seek to follow must deny themselves and take up the cross as well. As you might imagine, this revelation caused great distress among Jesus' followers, and it must still weigh heavy on the hearts of Peter and James and John as they witness Moses and Elijah appear before them on the mountaintop to flank the transfigured form of Christ. It is no wonder that the awestruck Peter's first response is to prolong and preserve this moment. "Lord, it is good for us to be up here," he says. "If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." We can imagine the jumbled thoughts running through Peter's mind. "Lord, it is good for us to be here, where we can dwell in the divine presence for all eternity, where you are safe and sound high above the crowds that will demand your life, where we can pretend that this is who you are, a God who radiates glory, a God who belongs in heaven, not on a Roman cross. Lord, it is good for us to be here, where none of us must face that suffering that awaits us at the foot of this mountain." But as Peter is still speaking, a voice from heaven interrupts his anxious attempt to rewrite this narrative. "This is my son," the voice says. "This is my son, the beloved, with him I am well pleased. Listen to him." We have heard this voice before at the baptism of Jesus. Now it thunders again to put a stamp of approval on Jesus' ministry. Yes, listen to him, God says, even when he instructs you to take up your cross and follow. Taking their cue from the ancestors of the faith, Peter and James and John fall to the ground in fear. After all, this is what one does in the presence of the Holy One. But then something simple happens, and it's something that changes everything. Jesus comes over to his disciples and touches them. It's the most human of gestures, coming from the one who has just stood before them as God. And in this radically ordinary moment, Jesus tells them what to do next. Get up. Do not be afraid. A simple touch, the most human of gestures, yet when it comes from Jesus, it's an encounter that transforms. We've seen it before in Matthew's gospel as touch affects the healing of the leper and the blind man and the woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. Now the same touch empowers Peter and James and John to do what is required of them. Get up, do not be afraid. Get up, hike back down this mountain. Get up and follow me. With this touch from the one who was just bathed in light, the disciples are transfigured from kneeling to standing, transformed from fearful to courageous. It's a subtle metamorphosis, but it's enough to empower these disciples to take the next steps with Jesus, steps they know will lead to the cross, but steps they take in hope. For they have witnessed the glory of God in the face of Christ, and perhaps even felt that glory radiating out from the palm of Christ's hand. I learned something else this week while studying this passage. I discovered that the Greek verb meaning to touch can be translated another way, to light or to kindle. Jesus came and lit a fire, saying, "Get up, do not be afraid." Obviously, the context begs that we stick with the translation that's before you in your pew Bibles. But this discovery made me wonder, what does this encounter with the divine kindle within us? It's hard to imagine that an ordinary human touch could affect such transformation, that such a fleeting encounter with the glory of God could ignite something within us. And yet, for so many of us, this is how we experience the glory and grace of God. In the touch of human hand upon human forehead and the feeling of water dripping down the brow, marking us as God's own forever. And hands pressing upon our shoulders, setting us apart for certain ministries in the life of the church, conveying the weight and blessing of this calling, in the embrace of a prayer shawl knit with love to hold us in times of sorrow, in a morsel of bread placed in the palm of our hands, just enough to sustain us on our journeys, to strengthen us for the path that lies ahead. Isn't that just the way of God? To convey glory beyond 1,000 sunrises, the glory that radiates from the face of the transfigured Christ through a crumb of bread or a drop of water, through a simple human touch. Isn't that just the way of God, to transform us through ordinary moments of grace that have power to jolt us from fear or distress and set us back on the path of discipleship? Like Peter, James, and John, we have witnessed and we have felt the glory of God. At least as much glory as a human hand can hold. And this encounter with the divine is enough to transform us from cowering in fear to rising with courage. It's enough to transform us by the grace of God to do what Jesus asks us to do. In the weeks ahead, we too will be summoned to walk down that mountain and face the pain and suffering of this world. As we enter the season of Lent, Jesus beckons us to walk the way of the cross, a way that winds through the valley of sorrow before taking us to a mountain lined with crosses where Jesus will breathe his last. But we go with hope. For we have witnessed the glory of God, and we know that there is more to this story than suffering and death. We know that this path ends on yet another mountaintop where we will meet the resurrected Christ face to face. So as we begin this journey, open your life to transformation, and may the touch of Christ kindle something within us. The spark of hope, the fire of courage, so that we too may heed the call of Christ Get up. Do not be afraid. Get up and follow me.